So I think a few people are in class now. Okay, I guess I'll begin my introduction and then we'll proceed with our first panel, our first panelist, and then some more people should join. Oh, just a moment. A panelist is having trouble joining. We'll just wait for her to join for Professor Stevens. Hello, Professor Stevens. Thank you very much for joining us. So I'll begin my introduction and then we'll proceed with our first panelist, Professor Valverde. So thank you to everyone for joining Rutgers International Law Society today for our fall 2020 inaugural panel to commemorate the UN International Day of Peace. The United Nations celebrates its 75th anniversary in 2020, and we should use this time to reflect not only on the progress attained in terms of forming global organizations and promoting guidelines to achieve a safer and prosperous world for all, but also on the work that still needs to be done to use such organizations and implement guidelines to, for example, protect human rights, fight climate change, and foster peaceful cooperation. The theme for this year's Day of Peace is Shaping Peace Together, which is quite fitting in light of the pandemic. If COVID-19 has taught us one thing, it has reminded us that in 2020, we live in a highly interconnected and interdependent world, for better or for worse. We are once more reminded that what happens domestically is not just the concern of the state, but that of the international community. It is more important than ever to foster cooperation among countries, as well as ensure the implementation of global public policy. Despite these apparent necessities, the global community is becoming increasingly fragmented. At a time when nations place more emphasis on individualism and nationalism, and countries flout international and human rights law without serious repercussion, what does the way forward look like when we face a common threat? We have invited Professors Valverde, Coicaud, and Stevens to bring their perspective on US health policy, international cooperation, and the importance of human rights, as well as maintaining legal and political legitimacy during and after the pandemic. Before we begin, we will join Rutgers Law School in observing a moment of silence in remembrance of the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She fought for social justice and equality of opportunity, ideals Rutgers Law and the International Law Society are proud to share. We will take a moment now to remember Justice Ginsburg. I will now introduce our first panelist. Professor Jennifer Valverde is a clinical professor of law and Professor Nadine Taub Scholar and legal director of HEAL Collaborative, a joint project of the Law School's Education and Health Law Clinic and Rutgers NJ Medical School's Pediatric Primary Care Clinic. Professor Valverde is an expert in special education law, the intersection of poverty, health and law, and interdisciplinary education. Today, Professor Valverde will discuss the relationship between health and peace, compare how the US prioritizes and addresses social determinants of health in relation to other OECD countries, and how COVID has brought to light and magnified issues of health, justice, and equity. Professor Valverde, you have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me here today. I'm particularly glad that you mentioned Justice Ginsburg, because one of the things that I keep coming back to is I was kind of devastated by her death and thinking about her life's work was that in an interview several years ago, she was talking about the importance of her dissents in her work. And the reason why she wrote dissents was because it gave her hope that one of the other justices might actually listen to what she had to say and perhaps change their minds, but also that even if that did not happen, that future people who would be reading the opinions would be moved by what she had to say. And so I keep kind of glomming on to that glimmer of hope that she had, you know, when she pretty much knew those times that her opinion might not be listened to, at least in the immediate present, that at some point in time in the future, perhaps it would be. So I think I just want to start today because some of what we're going to be talking about is not the prettiest of things, but to keep that glimmer of hope alive and to know that, you know, if we lose hope, then we lose everything. So we have to really focus on that. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint, just bear with me. Can everyone see this? Okay. Yeah. So, you know, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each slide, but I'm happy to answer questions later. I want to start just with the relationship between health and peace. We know that health and peace are basic human rights, that they're interdependent, and you really can't have one without the other. Public health is a cause and a consequence of the absence of peace. And when you think about situations where peace is absent, I think so often people's heads go to situations of war. But I encourage all of you to think of structural violence as equally, if not even more sinister. And the whole notion that structural violence prevents and destroys peace. And when I say structural violence, I'm talking about the ways in which social structures harm or otherwise disadvantage individuals and populations. To have a peaceful society, we know that the basic needs of people need to be met. And these needs are things like quality education, safe neighborhoods in which to live, affordable and quality health care. All of these things form the basis for a peaceful society. We also know that for a peaceful society, we have to have social justice and equity. And both things have to be perceived by all, not just by those who are in power. And the same holds true for a healthy society. Right now in this country, we're experiencing firsthand the breakdown of public health and peace. By watching COVID-19, it has brought front and center US's long-standing failure to meet the basic needs of all and to put the common good ahead of individual wants. And I want to take a few moments to just kind of talk about how this came to be. And to do that, we need to take a closer look at how we define and prioritize health. So let's first start with how the US spends money on health. So in terms of gross domestic product, we know that the US spends more money on healthcare than any other country in the world. And when we compare the US to the OECD, which are those 37 kind of market-based democracies that have signed on to the Convention on the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, what we see is that we spend almost double what the OECD average is on healthcare. In 2017, when we break it down, in 2017, the United States spent $11,172 annually per person on healthcare, whereas the OECD average was $4,000. So you have to ask yourself, does the money that we spend make the population any healthier? When we look at indicators for health, one of the first ones is infant mortality. When we compare the US to other OECD countries, we see that we come in number 33 out of 37. Only Mexico, Chile, Turkey, and Colombia performed worse. And when we compare ourselves to all other countries, we come in 54th, somewhere between Cuba and Qatar. Our US infant mortality rate is 5.8, and that is 2.5 times greater than countries like Estonia, Iceland, Finland, Japan, Czech Republic, Sweden, and Spain. Another indicator for the health of the population is life expectancy at birth. And when, again, we compare US to the OECD countries, we do slightly better, but not great. Number 27 out of 37. And when we look at ourselves versus all countries, again, we fall somewhere between Taiwan and Bahrain. For women, the number is worse. And the gap between the US and leading countries in terms of life expectancy as birth has increased to now more than 4 years. So what we can say is that despite having the most costly health system in the world, the United States consistently underperforms in most dimensions of health access measures, efficiency, and equity. So then let's think for a moment about maybe it's how we're spending our healthcare dollars. Let's take a look at that. 85% of total US healthcare dollars are spent on direct medical clinical care. So that's personal medical care. The problem is that health is much more than biology and genetics. It's also much more than individual behaviors. And this is something that many other countries long have recognized. Our focus on medical clinical care ignores the fact that many root causes of medical problems are not medical. They are in fact non-medical in nature, and we call these things social determinants of health. So these are these socioeconomic factors that can influence the prevalence of illness and disability, your access to care, the quality of care, and the type of medical care that you get. So what are some of those social determinants of health? Things like finances, nutrition, housing, childcare, transportation, employment, and education. Social determinants of health form the context in which individuals live. It includes where you live, where you go to school or work, the access to education, your access to nutritious food, whether or not you can get preventive care versus treatment. All of these things affect health. And then in addition to that, social determinants of context or social determinants of equity affect health. And that includes things like racism, capitalism, and systems of power. Race and ethnicity are interesting because they're both a social determinant of health themselves and a backdrop or context for all of the other social determinants of health. And we have to recognize that social determinants of health in the United States are inextricably linked to race and ethnicity. Now that we know that social determinants affect health, then you need to take a look at what we spend on social care. So public benefits programs, things like that, to address social determinants of health. And what we see is that we spend 19.2% of our gross domestic product on social care, whereas the OECD average is 21.6%, and 10 of those countries actually spend more than 25%, some more than 30% like Finland and France. To look at it another way, for every dollar that we spend in the US on medical clinical care, for every dollar that we spend on that, we spend approximately 90 cents on social services and public benefits programs. Whereas for the OECD countries, they spend approximately $1.50 to $2.30 on social services. So we have the lowest rate of social service to health expenditures of all moderate to high income countries. And to look at it another way, you can see just percentage-wise, the OECD spends far more on social services than they do on direct health care. How should healthcare dollars be spent? We should be spending 60% on social, environmental, and behavioral care. What does that mean? Well, that's derived from the fact that research has shown that preventive interventions that target behavior, the environment, and socioeconomic factors account for 80% reduction in illness and disease morbidity and mortality, whereas clinical care accounts only for a 20% reduction. That's a statistic that I often share with medical students, and they kind of cringe in horror recognizing that direct medical care really has such little effect when compared with non-medical care. So how did we get here? You have to take a second to think about US individualism versus the public health. So American individualism believes that in a good society, we are free to pursue what we want and what we need independently of others. And our country's founders believed that freedom to pursue your own ends would be moderated by a public spirit or a concern for the public good, and that in turn would help shape our social institutions. But the problem is what we see instead is a ruthless individualism and a lack of common purpose and concern for the common good. Consequences of this is that every social challenge then becomes framed as an issue of individual choice. What do I mean by that? Well, when we talk about early childhood development and childcare, we talk about them as things that matter for parental responsibility. Individual parents are responsible for that. Education is viewed as an individual endeavor, and if you succeed in education, then that's something that you did individually regardless of your privilege. Health is focused on your individual behaviors, not on your community and how your zip code might be affecting your health. American success overall is based on personal choice and determination, not how you got there. Diet is viewed as a personal choice and not your access to nutritious foods. And racism, we've seen, it's been front and center in the last 6 months, but it's been problematic for hundreds and hundreds of years. Racism continues to be viewed as an individual or an interpersonal issue instead of as a structural one. And as long as we keep individualizing America's successes and failures, we're never going to shift our focus to societal and public health to benefit the collective. This is so very different from countries like Denmark, Finland, where you have guaranteed basic income, access to social supports to ensure that basic needs are met. Here it's every person for themselves. So now with that backdrop, think about how has COVID-19 affected health and peace in this country? Well, first and foremost, it's highlighted the problem with the individual versus the common good. We see it every day in people refusing to wear masks and refusing to social distance because they claim that that's a violation of their personal rights, their individual freedoms, without recognizing that it can only benefit the public good to wear the masks and to socially distance. We also see COVID-19 highlighting and exacerbating long existing institutional and structural health justice and equity issues. Things like access to and quality of healthcare, issues of healthcare bias, food access, neighborhood condition and quality, childcare access, housing, we've got a looming eviction crisis, employment issues, and education access. When we look at the numbers as we approach 200,000, we're soon going to have 200,000 dead in this country alone. We compare the death rates and we look across races, and we find that the Black population, African American population in this country has a 2.6 times greater death rate, 4.7 times greater hospitalization rate. And then for the Hispanic Latinx population, we have a 2.8 times greater rate of cases, 4.6 greater rate of hospitalization. So these numbers are shocking and saddening and maddening all at the same time. And what we know is that due to different approaches containing the virus across countries, which are influenced by views of individualism versus the collective, as well as the quality and access to healthcare and other social supports to ensure basic needs are met, that's why we're seeing diverging rates of mortality, disease burden, and other measures of health outcomes between the US and economically comparable countries. So I want to just briefly highlight for a moment just education in general, which is one of the areas that I focus on, and the problems that we've seen just in education alone. And how has COVID-19 affected education? Well, it's really brought to light the haves versus the have-nots. Everything from access to remote versus in-person instruction. Many private schools right now are in-person. Most public schools in New Jersey are remote. The digital divide, do you have access to a computer or a laptop? Does it have good quality capacity to use the internet? Is your internet capacity okay? Do you even have internet based on where you live? How is remote instruction being defined? In the 600 school districts across New Jersey alone, so I'm just looking at one state, every city and town has defined remote instruction differently. And without having a unified definition of remote instruction, we have children getting some of them getting actual teachers teaching them, and others getting worksheets that maybe the teachers will look at. We have parents who can afford it paying for tutors and learning pods. We have significant issues regarding accessing special education supports and services, bilingual services, and ESL. Most people don't think of food when they think about education, but many of our low-income children across the state rely on schools to feed them, school breakfast and lunch. When schools are closed, they don't get fed. And yes, some schools are offering school breakfast and lunch, but you actually have to go there to pick it up, and you have to go there every day. So this is not something that is workable for many families. Effects of employment, so access to childcare when you have your children at home. Can you go to work? Are you leaving your kids because you have to go to work? Are the kids logging on by themselves or not logging on at all? And right now our courts are shut down for the most part. We have justice barely functioning. And so trying to remediate these rights that are lost is exceedingly difficult. So how do we attain peace? When we look at ourselves compared to other countries, we need to shift from symptoms to root causes. Stop looking at the effects and start looking at what are the causes of these problems. Start properly defining the problems as collective ones and not as individual ones. We know that protecting the vulnerable helps everyone. We need to act on that. Focus on science, not politics, and share and learn from others. Collaborate, don't compete. And finally, for youth of today, and I include all of you as part of youth as I approach 50 this February, read and learn, not the sound bites, but real reading, read books, read history. This is history repeating itself. We've been through pandemics before. Look at how we've addressed them. Look at what has worked and what hasn't. Read studies, don't read what the politicians are saying about the studies. Look at your values and promote values that believe in human dignity, public responsibility, social justice, and equity. Envision what you want your future to look like. Vote in line with that vision and act. Too often we think that words are enough. Words are no longer enough. They've not been enough. We need to actually act on those words. And sometimes the action might just be helping our neighbor, helping a family member, helping a friend, or it can be far bigger than that, but we need to do more than just speak. And I am done speaking.
Thank you very much, Professor Valverde. That was enlightening and at the same time troubling, but hopefully it just helps us ensure the values that we need to fight for, and hopefully we maintain that hope that you mentioned Justice Ginsburg had. So now we will turn to our second panelist this afternoon, Professor Coicaud. He is a professor of law and global affairs and is also a global ethics fellow with the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. He has served in a variety of esteemed positions throughout the world, but has significantly served in the Executive Office of the United Nations Secretary General as a speechwriter for Dr. Boutros Ghali. He has published extensively in the fields of legal and political theory, international law, international relations, and comparative politics. Today, he will discuss whether a nation's response to the virus can affect the legitimacy of its standing in the international community, the relationship between what the international community should prioritize to recover from the pandemic, and the million-dollar question whether peace is possible. Professor Coicaud.
Thank you, Dina. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for organizing this event. I saw that Jennifer has prepared a PowerPoint presentation. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so I feel very bad, but I'll try to put forward a few thoughts, although I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. So I mentioned to Dina, in fact, Dina is in my class on Monday morning and Wednesday morning, my class of international law. So that's why I guess she thought about me. So I mentioned to Dina that I would try to answer 3 questions. I would try to answer question 3. Has nations' response to COVID-19 at all affected their legitimacy in the international community? I would try to answer question 4. What should the international community and states English is very difficult. Give priority, let's say, to recover better from the pandemic. And question 9, I will try also to give a few thoughts on this, on what is the legitimate response to the pandemic. And then for fun philosophical question, as Dina puts it, is peace possible? And in fact, today is the day where the UN General Assembly starts here at the UN. I live near the UN. So for the first question, regarding how COVID-19 has affected the legitimacy of countries in the context of the international community. Clearly, what we have seen in the past 6 or 7 months is that we have what we could call winners and what we could call losers. But is to say that the crisis has had a reputational cost for a number of countries, and for others, the crisis has enhanced their reputation and therefore has played a role in somehow strengthening their sense of legitimacy domestically, but also internationally. So when it comes to the winners, you know, I established a list of possible winners. Clearly, Taiwan, Korea, Vietnam, Singapore for Asia, and in the European context, perhaps Germany are winners. And you know, when it comes to Taiwan, for instance, Taiwan, I do a lot of work in Taiwan, so I follow what's happening there. Taiwan has a population of about 25 million people, and yet the number of people who have you know, who have died following the COVID-19 is very small. It's no more than 10 people. Similarly, in Korea, very few people have died following COVID-19. Same thing in Vietnam, same thing in Singapore. And of course, all these, I mean, the success stories that these countries have been in terms of trying to you know, in terms of being able to contain COVID-19 has to do with the discipline with which people have followed the policies put forward by the government, and of course the systematic character of the policies being put forward by the government in these countries. I mean, you know, a few days ago I was seeing the gentleman in charge of COVID-19 in Taiwan, who was trained in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins, and he was telling us how, in fact, the approach of the government has been systematic, and how the government has been systematic in asking and having people complying with their policies, which of course hasn't been the case in the US. Same thing in Korea, same thing in Vietnam. So in fact, the success of these countries has been based on systematic policies in terms of addressing the crisis, and then asking for systematic compliance and making sure that people comply in a very, very strict fashion. The losers in terms of reputation, in terms of legitimacy, domestically and internationally, of course, we know them. In Europe, it's France, it's the UK, it's Italy, and Spain. The sense that the level of casualties, the number of people who have died out of COVID is very, very high. In France, for instance, of course, the government for years has been telling us that we have the best system, healthcare system in the world. Of course, it's not the case. And so these countries in Europe have taken really a hit in terms of their reputation, in terms of their credibility domestically, at the regional level and at the international level. And of course, the loser of all losers is the US. From the start, the handling of the crisis has been a disaster. I remember speaking with friends in late March, early April, friends in Washington. They were telling me that the problems with the handling of the crisis was a matter of negligence. I think that it goes much beyond negligence. It's a matter of incompetence. It's almost a matter of criminal incompetence, the way it has been handled. I mean, at the federal level and at the state level. I think even in the US a few weeks ago, Cuomo was somehow claiming that he had done a great job. I don't think that Cuomo and the mayor have done a great job in terms of containing the crisis, especially in the early days of the crisis. So I think that the reputational toll that this has taken on the US domestically and internationally is enormous. And of course, a loser in all this is also China, since in the end, the crisis originated in China. There was also in the early days of the crisis a cover-up, and somehow this will have to be addressed once the crisis is over. This is something to think about for the way forward. So these are the few thoughts that I had on the first question, question 3. Question 4, what should the international community and states give priority to in terms of recovering better from the pandemic? When I compare, the sense of order at the domestic level and at the international level, I tend to refer to the relationship between cooperation and competition. So, in a well-functioning society at the domestic level, the ability for this society to function well is based on competition among individuals, actors, and so on, taking place, unfolding within a framework of cooperation. That's how a well-functioning society functions well. That is to say, cooperation happens, but no competition happens among actors, but within a framework, an established framework of cooperation. And the system of law, the political system, the justice system is meant to make sure that cooperation prevails. At the international level, for a number of reasons, in fact, when there is cooperation in fact takes place, unfolds within a framework of competition. So what prevails at the international level is not cooperation, it's competition. And in a way, somehow, as a way to better from this type of pandemic, but from any kind of problem happening at the global level, this applies also to security issues, to environmental issues, and so on. We have to find ways through which somehow we rebalance the relationship between cooperation and competition. We have to find ways through which it's not competition which prevails at the international level, but cooperation. So that would be, in a way, my generic answer to your question, Dina. How do we rebalance the relationship between cooperation and competition so that, in fact, competition is not the main theme of reference, but cooperation. And this is something to think about, once again, in all global problems having to do with the pandemic, but also security issues, environmental issues, even development issues. Okay, in the end here, the key point is that while we tend to think, at least in international politics, that justice is external and secondary to security, in the end, the best way to achieve security, including sanitary or health security, is to envision the fact that justice is internal and central to the question and the pursuit of security, including sanitary security. Okay, so this is what I wanted to say on the second point. What is a legitimate response to the pandemic going forward? This is question 9. Here, I think that we have to be much more aware of the fact that rights are by definition, by nature, social. See, as Jennifer mentioned, you know, the people who don't want to wear a mask in the US, but also in Europe, in Germany. In Germany, you have demonstrations because people are tired of wearing a mask. So what we hear from them is that, you know, it's my right not, not to wear a mask, as if a right was an individual matter, as if a right was an asocial matter. In fact, rights are by definition social. It is the extent to which we respect the rights of others that our own rights are being secured and enjoyed. So the social dimension of rights should lead us to think that even though some people argue that it is their rights to not wear a mask, in the process, they of course affect the rights of others of being healthy, of not being sick, but they also undermine their own right to health in a way. So a philosophical and legal answer to the question would be somehow to put forward, to insist, to stress the social dimension of rights. Rights are not really self-contained, self-standing things. They are social by nature. They are part of a dynamic of reciprocity, of dynamic of rights and duties. And it seems that a lot of people in the context of this pandemic haven't understood this, and that's, I think, part of the problems. Final question, and Dina phrased it as a fun philosophical question. Is peace possible? So once again, when I talk about peace, I always like to compare what I call the possibility of peace. I always like to compare what I call the Reagan model and the Master Shifu model. So I don't know if you recall, but in the 80s, when Reagan was president, he was asked the question, how can we achieve peace, you know, at the global level? And his answer was, you know, we achieve peace through being exposed to an enemy, and then us coming together to confront this enemy. So it's the adversarial, if you will, quest for peace. So that's the Reagan model. And the Master Shifu model, I don't know if you know this, is the following. I don't know if you have ever seen this cartoon Kung Fu Panda, which I like very much. And so in Kung Fu Panda, you have Master Shifu, who is the person training Kung Fu Panda. And his answer, his solution for achieving peace is to find peace within oneself, and through peace achieve within oneself, we are going to be able to achieve peace with others. The idea being, you know, if you're at war with yourself, you're going to be at war with others. If you're at peace with yourself, you're going to be at peace with others. So when having to choose, or if we're in a position to choose between the Reagan model and the Master Shifu model, of course, I'm going to choose the Master Shifu model. So is peace possible? Yes. In order to find out how we can achieve peace, let's watch Kung Fu Panda. That's it.
Thank you, Professor Coicaud, very much.
Thank you, Dina.
Enlightening and inspiring discussion.
Yeah, Kung Fu Panda is a great cartoon. I recommend it.
Good to know. So we will now turn to our third and final panelist, Professor Beth Stevens, who is a distinguished professor of law and has written on the relationship between international and domestic law, focusing on the enforcement of international human rights norms through domestic courts and the incorporation of international law into US law. As a cooperating attorney with the Center for Constitutional Rights, Professor Stevens continues to litigate pro bono human rights cases. Professor Stevens has worked on such cases as Mamani v. Berzain, a lawsuit against the former president of Bolivia for human rights violations, and Samantar v. Yusuf, a human rights case decided by the Supreme Court. Today, Professor Stevens will talk about the relationship between peace and human rights, the regulation of human rights norms, and the impact of COVID-19 on international accountability mechanisms. Professor Stevens, thank you for joining us today. I'm sorry, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you, Deanna, and the International Law Society for organizing this panel, inviting me to speak. I wish I had something as interesting as Kung Fu Panda. It's hard to follow that, and nor do I have a PowerPoint. But I appreciate the opportunity to talk broadly about both peace and COVID-19 and about their relationship to human rights and human rights accountability, which are my particular areas of work. Building on what the prior panelists have said, I do want to frame my talk broadly by emphasizing the important connection between international peace and international human rights protection. And as we've heard, peace is not just the absence of war or armed conflict. A world in which people are enslaved, abused, denied adequate food, housing, education, healthcare, and other basic rights is not a world at peace. As I define it, and as I think we should define it. So COVID-19 in particular has had a devastating impact on economic and social human rights. Nationalism, populism, the international community's failure to cooperate have all meant that around the world, people living in precarious positions have been denied assistance from the wealthiest people and nations, from the people who could afford it. And the statistics from the United Nations are horrific. 100 million people could be pushed into extreme poverty. I would say that could be an understatement. Over 250 million could face acute food shortages. Again, that could be an understatement. Early on, an estimated 400 million people lost jobs. 1.5 billion students have lost their schooling and may never return to school. And then, of course, this all disproportionately affects women, brown and black people around the world. And of course, the same pattern is evident in the United States as well, in terms of the devastating impact and the disproportionate impact. On an international level, the United Nations made a request for contributions to an emergency coronavirus response plan to help the neediest, which is something the United Nations does regularly. And that fund, which didn't ask for very much, $10 billion, has received just 1/4 of the requested funds, which the UN relief official described as tepid as best. And I think that's perhaps being even overly generous, but it's also significantly worse than the less than stellar global response to disasters in the past. And that pattern as well is clear in the United States as well. People are suffering while millionaires and billionaires become even wealthier, with no significant political push for them to share that wealth. Just across the river in New York City, this is a statistic that I've read about in the last week or two, and it just continues to shock me, that the New York City school system includes over 100,000 homeless children. It's over 20%, I believe, of the total number of students in the education system. Their basic human rights were violated before the pandemic, but now in addition, they're deprived of the inadequate schooling, something that they were receiving. And as we heard, of the services that they had access to through their schools, food and sometimes social workers, and at best, when it works well, a caring adult who's can be aware of some of the things going on in their lives. So within the United States and worldwide, I would say true peace requires a human rights approach, requires a sharing of the fruits of our labor, so that all people have the basic economic and social human rights. Before the pandemic, the world was making progress, not enough, halting, scandalously, shockingly inadequate, but there was progress in reducing at least the worst levels of poverty and trending in the right direction. So the divisions that the world has shown and this country has shown in response to COVID-19 reflect a worsening of the divisions that have made it so difficult to address poverty and inequity in past decades. So millions of people face food shortages, loss of housing, loss of education, loss of health care as a result of the pandemic. And in the critical area of healthcare human rights, sound public health guidance would allocate any vaccine first to the people most at risk. And I think it's very clear that that is not the way the world is going right now. So that the human rights dimensions of even when if and when we get to a successful response are going to be involve more violations and less of a human rights perspective. So stepping back again, pre-COVID, or in more general terms, as I've said, I think that peace requires the protection of human rights. And segueing a bit to the work that I most often do, the protection of human rights requires that there be mechanisms to hold accountable those who violate human rights. And that means both to punish them and to deter others. This has always been difficult around the world, although there have been some successes over the past few decades. Really, the biggest step forward in this area coming more than a few decades ago after World War II, when leaders of the Nazis and the Japanese were actually held accountable on a relatively wide and important scale for their human rights abuses. That impetus towards holding particularly government leaders accountable has really diminished over the decades. But private efforts to hold towards accountability have largely addressed violent human rights abuses, genocide, executions, torture, less so social and economic rights. And I've been fortunate to be part of a large multinational accountability community, which has tried multiple strategies to address all of these human rights abuses. These include what is my specialty, which is filing civil lawsuits in US courts for human rights abuses committed outside of the United States. And then other tactics that have been used, pressuring governments to file criminal charges, including in the United States, with limited success, but a couple of important examples. Bringing claims before international human rights bodies, including the Inter-American System, the European Human Rights System, and various UN bodies, setting up truth commissions to document abuses. Success for this movement is always hard to measure. The goals of accountability are to punish those responsible and to deter future abuses. Often we don't get to punishment. We file a claim. I'm speaking very, very broadly here about but often the claims are filed, and sometimes they might result in a final judgment in terms of the ones in US courts. Often that final judgment is not actually enforceable. We're working right now there's a multi-billion-dollar judgment against Radovan Karadzic, who was the leader of the Bosnian Serbs and responsible for genocide particularly in Bosnia-Herzegovina, part of the former Yugoslavia. He actually defended against the lawsuit up to challenging personal jurisdiction, subject matter jurisdiction, and then when it started in discovery, but as it got further into discovery and was set for trial, he pulled out and defaulted. and the judgment was issued against him. And I think it's been 20 years. And after 20 years, if you want to eventually enforce a judgment, you have to renew it. So here we are renewing this $1 billion judgment against Radovan Karadzic, who fortunately is in prison. He's in prison in the Netherlands because he was brought before the Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia, a UN body. So he is being punished. And we're convinced that he has money someplace, but whether, you know, whether that is a success to have gotten that judgment, whether it contributed in any way to the international appetite to bring him up for criminal charges, maybe I'm not so sure. But it's still it's part of, it's one more piece of, you know, one more tool available. And so I would say that success is measured, again, not just in punishing the particular people who are targeted, and not just in whether money damages can be brought against them, or there are concrete other measures, other ways in which they have been impacted, but also in terms of the movement, the international movement for human rights accountability, and for the prevention of human rights violations. So, you know, do any of these measures have an impact in terms of making other people think more carefully before they engage in the human rights violation? The case that I've been working on most recently, which Diana mentioned, against comes out of massacres in Bolivia in 2003. And there was a criminal prosecution in Bolivia of a group of generals who are still in prison in Bolivia, and a long-running civil lawsuit, which is what I worked on in the United States, against the ex-president and the former defense minister, who couldn't be prosecuted in Bolivia because they came to the United States. We won a trial 2.5 years ago, a successful verdict from a jury. The judge threw it out just a month or two ago. The appellate court reversed the trial court judge, and we're now going back before the trial court judge to see whether he's going to throw it out again or not. In which case, we're sure that they will appeal. But the consequence for them has been 17 years of having this chase them around, not being able to get away from it. But we've also been told that in Bolivia, the fear of prosecution has changed the calculation, particularly for the military officials, that they know that if they order their troops to fire on unarmed civilians, they might be held accountable. In that case, I think the criminal prosecution is the more serious one. People actually went to jail. The fact that you might be sued, yes, I think can also be another piece of that. Now, just recently, the military has fired on unarmed civilians in Bolivia, which was depressing to me in a whole different way, because than many human rights abuses, from the sense of futility, that it is so hard to break these cycles. But I have people who are just as depressed and worried about what's going on in Bolivia right now, who see it as less futile, who see that there was one outbreak of violence, there has not been more, that maybe we did have an impact. And in any event, you've got to keep trying, right? You've got to keep trying. So holding people accountable, I'm convinced, is the only way to achieve peace and the only way to deter the kinds of violations that disrupt the peace in the future. My father was worked for his entire life for unions and labor organizer, very committed, very progressive unions, and yet he was totally cynical about unions themselves, which are often corrupt, and about our ability to change the world. And yet he kept working, and it's not a very optimistic message to give to law students, but I'm convinced that not only that we need to keep working, but also that the fact that we are realistic about the odds that we are up against, does not need to deter us. And I would think that that Justice Ginsburg, would be a very good person from whom we could learn this lesson. What the odds that she was up against, and yet it didn't keep her from pushing forward. So the one other point that I want to make about human rights accountability, which I think is very relevant to what we've been talking about in terms of social and economic rights, is how much even more difficult it is to hold anyone responsible for violations of economic and social rights, and in particular to hold corporations responsible. So that the work that I've done, for a good part of it, the goal was to use the precedents of individual human rights accountability against corporations, and we were making quite a lot of progress with that until 2013, when the Supreme Court shut down a big chunk of it. In a later decision, I think in 2018, they shut down another chunk, and there's a case pending this term before the Supreme Court where they're likely to shut down at least the use of the US statutes against corporations. And this is just a pattern. They have been, corporations have been so successful around the world in pushing back against accountability. And I realized that I think there's a pattern there that I think is very similar to the pattern of in the gig economy, in the contractor as the employee as contractor economy, where the Uber doesn't hire employees who it has to pay regular wages and benefits and unemployment insurance. Instead, it has contractors. Well, similarly, large corporations have divided themselves up so that instead of having branches in another country, they hire a corporation, which they may have helped set up, and they may even have their name, or may just be a factory in Bangladesh that's producing something for them. And then they buy the product for them, and they have no responsibility for the employees who work for that company. And when they are sued, they have no responsibility for the abuses that are committed there, and no responsibility for the economic and social health and human rights of the people who work there. So COVID-19 has just made all of this more difficult because of the financial impact, and the fact that, because of the travel impacts, because these are international, because we can't meet together. And although the carbon imprint of our meetings was high, the getting together and sharing stories was also a big part of human rights organizing. But as governments turn inward, as they don't fund different projects, as they worry more about their own benefit, their own prosperity, and less about others. But to achieve peace, to achieve human rights accountability, to achieve human rights, to achieve peace, I also am convinced that it requires cooperation. It requires that we fight the nationalism and the self-centered approach to the pandemic and to these other challenges, because the multiple challenges we face can't be resolved individually, and they can't be avoided, and human rights can't be achieved in one country at the expense of others. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Stevens. We'll now begin our open panel discussion. We have just some time where the other panelists can share their ideas, perhaps in response to what Professor Stevens has said, or elaborate on what they said. I'll start off the panel discussion with just one question. Professor Stevens was talking about accountability, and in the domestic scene, we have the doctrine of negligence in tort law, whereas in the international dimension, much of it stems on acts, genocide, and human rights abuses. Is there precedent, or it seems during COVID right now, a lot of the issues stem from inaction rather than action. Governments failing to enforce mask mandates or something similar, establishing agencies too late to deal with COVID. And so is there a precedent for holding governments accountable for inaction?
Well, there's a,
Sorry, Professor Stevens, Professor Valverde has to leave, but thank you very much for your participation and have a wonderful day.
yeah, it's a big issue in international human rights. There is an obligation on states to take steps towards realizing social and economic rights under the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The US doesn't agree with that and doesn't join that. But there is an international obligation. What it means to the best of your resources to be able to do it has never been clear. And whether there's as we learn in international law, and enforcement of international law is always a problem. But in economic, in terms of a requirement to take action, it's that much more difficult.
If our panelists, Professor Coicaud and Stevens, don't have anything else to elaborate on, we can open the floor to Q&A. So if any of our audience members have questions, you're welcome to join in.
Hi, Dina. I have a question to Professor Coicaud and as well to Professor Stephens too. My name is Indu and I am a master's student in global affairs. So like Professor Coicaud, my question is to you. Firstly, like you mentioned the losers and failures states in the pandemic. Yeah, I agree with that. That if we see that in the person who lost their lives in this pandemic, and when we compare to the Taiwan and the Korea, but when we compare to the demography or when compared to the population, the US population is 330 million and the Taiwan population is 23 million and the Korea population is 51 million. So I'm not able to understand that how can we say that it's a failure. I know that there might be lack of infrastructure or might not the speedy action that is lagging. But and when I see that New York City is a global hub of the commuters rather than the Seoul and the Taipei, the capital of Taiwan. So people are traveling, a lot of people are traveling in at that time, like in the New York City, rather than to the Taiwan, to the Korea. So what I think could you please tell me the losers and the winners, because I'm not able to understand that. Professor, you are mute.
The expression winners and losers in a very casual fashion, so the Taiwan has 25 million people, or 23. So in order to reach, and the US has 350 million, let's say. So, if you, so, and it had 10 casualties due to COVID, Taiwan. If you multiply by 13, you still have 150. So even though, the bottom line is that Taiwan has a tradition and has a good public policy, especially as applied to public health. That's not the case in the US. You have very good schools of public policy in the US. The paradox is that you hardly have a tradition and a good tradition of public policy. The culture, I mentioned this in my course, the culture and the discourse of right in this country is not underwritten by traditions of public policy and traditions of public goods. So that's one of the key problems in this country. And so this is one of the reasons why you have such a high level of mortality. The mishandling of the crisis in this country is due to lack of coordinated policies, incompetence, and lack of public policy, which precedes, in fact, the crisis. I think. And you know, Singapore, Taiwan, Vietnam, Korea are countries which have strong policies, that is to say, in place policies designed to look after people in times of crisis as well as in time of non-crisis, if you will. That's not the case here.
All right, Professor. Thank you. And my question is like to the Professor Stephen, that you have been working with the many organizations that you mentioned the Bolivian authoritarian regime. So I just want to know, I'm curious to what kind of backlash these institutions have when they deal with this authoritarian regime, they deal with the dictators. Like when I was following the Myanmar case, like when there was a democratic leader, like before that, like she is the de facto leader over there. She came to the international ICC for the hearing. So I didn't find it that there was a much effect that she was rejecting the claim of genocide of Rohingyas. So there is a type of allies like the China and Russia? Are they affecting the institutions that are working against them? Professor?
Yeah, I see. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think there's backlash at every level to efforts to hold at accountability. The human rights accountability in the United States was most successful when the targets were not powerful people or institutions. So the first cases were against, an individual, a policeman from Paraguay, a general from Argentina after the Argentine junta had been forced out. So he, at a point where he no longer had much authority behind him. Cartage never had any very minimal support within the United States, and certainly not in the United States government. When the cases started targeting individuals who came from countries that were allies of the United States, like Israel, when they started targeting corporations, and when they started targeting officials of the United States government, excuse the expression, all hell broke loose. And the U.S. government, which had been, depending on the administration, the Democrats tended to support the cases, not very enthusiastically. The Republicans opposed them, but didn't take it particularly seriously. But then they really turned against the cases. And so, on an international level as well. And when I talk about the accountability movement, an important part of it was happening first in Europe with efforts, universal jurisdiction, to file criminal charges against former government officials in Belgium and then in Spain. And as soon as those cases were successful, I mean, there's such a hunger for accountability that groups from around the world sort of gathered, went to those countries to try to file cases. When they were filed against officials from China, against U.S. officials, the countries immediately shut them down. I mean, filing claims against U.S. President Bush for his totally illegal invasion of Iraq and the abuses committed during that, led to changes in the laws so that these claims couldn't be brought. So yes, there is a backlash, and corporations is just as much, although they've done it at times in different ways, but very successfully, I think.
All right. Thank you.
But Beth, this shows that in fact even democratic countries are not very committed to human rights.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, yeah. That's I agree.
What,
yeah.
Thank you, Professor.
And that's unfortunate, realizing the hypocrisy rampant in international law as well as domestic law, and trying to combat that when countries insist that they follow human rights and yet their actions show otherwise.
It's going to be the work of your generation, Dina. You have plenty of work ahead of you.
Yeah.
Well, yes, hopefully we'll be able to, change something.
Mm-hmm.
Does any other member of our audience have a question? If not, I suppose we'll wrap this up. And thank you to our audience members, and thank you, first of all, to our panelists. Unfortunately, Professor Valverde had to leave, but we're very grateful for her presentation, and also to Professor Coicaud and Professor Stevens for this enlightening discussion and
depressing.
Yes, depressing at the same time, but hopefully it is motivating to hopefully for us to make changes in our society.
Yes.
So thank you very much again, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Dina. Thank you, Beth. Thank you.
Good to see you.